Good morning. Today we are doing CO1, our first objective. We started this yesterday, and we're going to go review what we talked about yesterday with the definitions, and then we're going to go down into the lesson. So CO1 is I can describe integers, compare integers, and identify an integer's opposite and absolute value. So in order to do that, we need to know what those terms mean. So an integer is a positive or negative number that is not what? What can an integer not be? Who remembers from yesterday? Jillian.
Decimal or a fraction?
It cannot be a decimal or fraction. So if it is an integer, it's just that number. It's not a decimal, it's not a fraction. So you should be double checking your book, making sure you wrote the full definition out. The absolute value is the distance of a number from zero. So when we have that number line, we have that zero there, whether it's going in the positive direction or it's going in the negative direction, it's how far away from zero is it? So we don't have negative numbers when it's an absolute value. We're just counting how far away from zero. The opposite are two numbers that are the same distance from zero. They have the same absolute value. So if we make this number line going from 0 to 12, and from 0 to negative 12, we can see positive 12 and negative 12 are both 12 spaces away from 0. So they are opposites from each other. The further the number goes to the right from 0, the greater its value, the bigger that number gets. So I see friends that have their Math Masters binders out. I need those put away right now. We should only have Math 6 out. Thank you. So the further to the left a number is, what do you think we need to fill in for that? If the further to the right, the greater it gets, the further to the left, what, James?
Smaller.
The smaller, the lesser the value. Nolan, do you have a question?
Is it okay if people put higher and lower settings?
So they mean kind of the same thing, but greater and lesser are math terms. So we want to get used to using those math terms. Bigger and smaller makes sense also, but again, we want the mathy terms, okay? We're mathematicians in here, we're going to use those math terms. Your binder? Real quick, you should have had that already. So we're going to be using the true math terms to make us true mathematicians. So yes, smaller and bigger, higher and lower, they make sense and we understand what they mean, but I want us to get used to the math terms.
Okay.
All right, so do we have all of this filled in? Can I scroll up? Okay. it's pretty easy to mistakenly think negative 10 is greater than negative 8, for example, because your brain reverts to thinking of 10 and 8, not the negative numbers. So I'm going to rewrite that number line that I put up there. So if we have negative 10 and negative 8, and we have 10 and 8, the further to the left, when we're going to the left, the smaller, the lesser the number. So 10 is less, negative 10 is less than negative 8 because it's farther to the left. But a lot of times we think of the positive 8 and positive 10, and we're thinking we're going to the right. So be very careful when it's those negative numbers. Think about farther to the left, the lesser the number. Think of the number line as a thermometer. We live in Minnesota. We know our negative temperatures, right?
Yeah.
Negative 10 degrees is a lot colder than well, not a lot colder, a little bit colder than negative 8 degrees. But it's colder, it's going down, right? When we think of that thermometer, and we have a 0 here, and when we're going up, the hotter it gets, and oh my goodness, if it's a 90-degree day, whoo, it's hot. But we know when we're going down into the negatives, we have negative 10 versus negative 20. Negative 20 is going to be colder. Negative 40, oh my goodness, they're going to close school. We're going to get a snow day. Yeah, we like negative 40. That's kind of a magic number. So we like it when it gets to negative 40. We like snow days. It's a fun thing that we get to have when we live in Minnesota.
What degrees do we have to get to
Negative 40. It's either negative 40 or negative 45.
Oh, 40.
Yeah, it's got to get really cold. But think of that when you're looking at negative numbers. Think about colder, colder, colder. Okay, those numbers are less. Hotter, 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 those numbers are greater. Okay, Jillian.
Should we write the negative 10, negative 8, and then 8, 10, and 10?
If it would help you to understand it, you can. Okay. That one's your choice. All right, you can easily compare the values of numbers by plotting them on a number line. This is something that I told last year's group all the time. And the kids that finally started listening to me and drawing their number lines out, they were really starting to understand those negative numbers. If you don't draw the number line out, sometimes it can get really tricky and you can get easily confused. There's nothing wrong with drawing a number line on your paper to help you. That is a good tool to be able to do. Just remember that going to the right is your positive numbers, going to your left are your negative numbers. So we need to determine whether each number is an integer. If it is, write its opposite and absolute value. If it is not, explain why it's not. So we're going to do a couple together, and then we're going to look at what we're doing on the next page. So, number 9, the 9, is that an integer? Is 9 an integer? Look back up at our definition of integer. A positive or negative number that is not a decimal or a fraction. Yes, so we're going to write integer. JT?
Can I write initials?
Nope, I want you to write integer. I want you to write it out because I want you to get used to what that word looks like and what it means. So because it is an integer, we need to write its opposite. This one I'll let you do the O, and its absolute value. So what is the opposite of 9? Look back up. Opposite means two numbers that are the same distance from 0 on that number line. So if we have 9, what's its opposite, Melina? -9. And then we need to put what its absolute value is. So what would 9's absolute value be? The absolute value is how far away from 0 is it?
9. Oh, -9. 9.
So if 9 is right here, we need to count how far away from 0 it is. How far away is it? 9. It's 9 away from 0. So its absolute value is 9. -9 is the opposite. When it's an absolute value, it will never, ever, ever have a negative in it. Because we're just counting how far away from 0 it is. So -9 and +9, they're both 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 away from 0. So it doesn't matter if you're negative or positive, it's how far away from 0 are you. So now let's look at our next one, -3.2. 3 2/10. Oh, I see some friends shaking their heads no. Why is this not an integer? That it? So we're going to write no, and we're going to write decimal. Integers cannot have a decimal. Four-fifths. Integer or not an integer?
Not.
Thumbs up, thumbs down. You're right, thumbs down. Why is it not an integer? Aiden?
It's a fraction.
It's a fraction. Fractions cannot be integers. -6. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Is it an integer?
Yes.
Thumbs up. It is an integer because there is no decimal and there is no fraction. So that means we need to find its opposite and its absolute value. What is the opposite of -6? A and B. 6.
Oh.
You had your hand up.
6.
Yeah, 6. So opposite of -6 is a +6. What is its absolute value? Let's see. So how far away would -6 be from 0? We're just going to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 6 away. So really, guys, the absolute value is you take the number and you take any negative signs off, and that's its absolute value. Okay? If it's -6, it's 6 away from 0. Its absolute value is 6. If it's +6, it's 6 away from 0. Its absolute value is 6. So the absolute value is your integer with no negative signs. So you just take any negative signs off, and that's its absolute value. Aiden.
So like -35, the opposite would be 35, and then the absolute value would be 35.
Yeah. Okay. So your opposite is if it's a negative, you make it a positive. If it's a positive, you make it a negative. The number stays the same. Absolute value. You're taking that negative off. And that's its absolute value. Your number always stays the same. Okay. Let's look at the next page. Circle the greater integer. Check your answer by plotting the numbers on a number line. So, when it says check your answer, do you think you should check your answer? Yes. Okay, do you always have to have your number line start at 0? No. So when we get to negative 122, I don't expect you to be starting at 0 and going all the way to the left to negative 122. But you can draw your number line and say, okay, if I'm at negative 112, then I'm going to go to the left. And I know my negative numbers get less than when we go to the left, so which one is going to be my greater integer?
Negative 112.
Negative 112, because it's closer to 0. Because I know 0 is going to be over there. So it's closer to the 0. So do you need to draw your number line? Yes.
Yes.
I didn't draw all of my marks to the 0, but I did put a 0 on there to help me. So when I have my positives, I can go like this and go 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 is farthest to the right, so I know 10 is greater. Here, I knew negative 122 is farther to the left, so it's lesser. So I didn't want it. Does that make sense on what you need to do? Let's do one more together. Here, I am going to go on both sides of the 0 because negative 2 is on the left and 6 is on the right. So you always want to look at where the numbers are in relation to 0. If they're negative, it's the one that's closest to 0. If they're positive, it's the one that's farther away from the 0. Jillian?
Do we have to do the number line every time if
Yep.
we know?
Yep. So on the test, you don't have to, but on your homework, we do. We're going to do the number line every time. And you know what? We have lots of work time in class, so we have time to do it. So let's look at our next section.
So we have these 2 pages for homework.
Well, let's just go through it. These ones are word problems. Which is greater, 15 or the opposite of negative 17? So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to write down what is the opposite of negative 17.
17.
It's 17. So now, which is greater, 15 or 17?
17.
17 is a bigger number. Okay. So make sure you figure out what the work is that you have to do so you're comparing the correct numbers. So when it says which is greater, 15 or the opposite of negative 17, write down what that opposite of negative 17 is so you know what you're comparing. Which is greater, 20 or the absolute value of 19? What is the absolute value of 19? 19. So now we know we're comparing 20 and 19. So write down what this is so you know what to compare. Who has a question? Who can ask me? Let's see if we can come up with a question based on today's work. Can anybody think of a question to ask? Matthew.
What is greater, the absolute value of 8 or the opposite of negative 10? Yeah, that's one.
So what is the well? Is that
Yes,
well? That's one of our questions. I'm not going to answer the question for you. So good try, but I'm not going to give you the answer to your homework.
I was not trying.
So what you're going to want to do, Matthew, to solve that, you're going to want to write down what is the opposite of 8. Write that down. And what is the absolute value of negative 10? Write that down. And then you're going to write what your answer is. So would my answer be, let's look at this. The opposite of 8 is negative 8, right? What's the absolute value of 10? Absolute value of negative 10? 10. So which one is greater? So what am I going to write for my answer? Jillian?
Oh, sorry. It was a question.
What am I going to write for the answer for this one?
10.
But is 10 in my original question?
No.
Bennett? So I would write absolute value of -10 because that's what was in my question. So my answer is the absolute value of -10 is the greater number. So I'm not going to write 10 because 10 wasn't in my question, right? Absolute value of -10. Always go back to the original question. Up here, I made the mistake. I wrote 17. I should have wrote opposite of -17. That was my mistake. Always go back to your original question and write what it was. So it's the opposite of -17. The absolute value of -10. Jillian.
Do we have to explain our thinking on the last question?
I'm thinking of a negative integer that is a distance of 16 away from its opposite. What is it? It does not ask you to explain your thinking.
What should I
So
do?
it's always a good idea to explain your thinking. So that way, if you get it wrong, we can see where you went wrong with your thinking. Sometimes when we correct the next day and somebody goes, oh, well, I put 15 for my answer. And I go, well, how did you get 15? And they go, I don't remember. So for a problem like that, where you write down what you think the answer is, put why you think that. So that way tomorrow we can work it out. If you don't get it correct, we can figure out where you went wrong. Any other questions? James.
How'd you get 19 over the second question, which is greater 20 with the opposite?
So what's your question?
How do you get it?
So the 19 isn't my answer. The 19 is the absolute value of 19 is 19. I didn't write an answer here. So you still have to write which one is greater, the 20 or the absolute value of 19.
Okay.
So I like to just write what it is, and then I decide what the answer is going to be. Okay. Good questions. All right, for those of you listening at home, we hope you have a wonderful day.